Alcibiades was condemned by default. His estate was confiscated, and it was further decreed that his name should be publicly cursed by all priests and priestesses. It is said that Theano, the daughter of Menon, of the Deme of Agrule, was the only one who refused to execute this decree. She declared that she was a priestess dedicated to prayer, not to curses. When this terrible judgment and sentence were passed on Alcibiades, he was living at Argos, for he had crossed over to the Peloponnese immediately after escaping from Thurii. But even there, he still went in fear of his enemies, and he now decided to renounce his country altogether. So he sent word to the Spartans, asking for asylum, and promising that he would render them services greater than all the harm he had done them when he was their enemy. The Spartans granted his request and received him. As soon as he arrived, he lost no time in getting one vital measure carried out. The Spartans had been hesitating over sending help to the Syracusans and putting off any definite action. But Alcibiades so stirred them up and encouraged them that they dispatched Gylippus to Sicily with orders to take command and destroy the Athenian army. Another stroke of his was to persuade them to renew operations against the Athenians in Attica, and thirdly, and most important of all, to fortify Deceleia. It was this, more than any other single action, which wore down the resources of Athens and finally ruined her. That is from the life of Alcibiades, which is part of this collection of Plutarch's lives. This is the rise and fall of Athens. 9 Greek lives by Plutarch. Plutarch, famously the Greek writer of biographies. He lived around 45 AD in Greece at the time, which was in the time of the Roman Empire, when Greece was part of the Roman Empire. So he was an historian talking about the olden days, and he tells this. He actually does kind of tell the story of the rise and fall of Athens in this through these 9 Greek lives. These were all part of the book that he wrote, the lives of the Greeks and the Romans, or parallel lives, where basically he would compare a life of a famous Greek with the life of a famous Roman. I kind of wish that Penguin would have an edition of just the lives. Other publishers do it. They should have, in the Penguin Classics, maybe a Penguin Deluxe edition of Plutarch's Lives. It's a big book, but Penguin publishes some big books. So there's really no excuse not to have that. You could have that and what they did here. Basically, they took the lives, they took them all out of the parallel lives, and they divided it up by subject and time. And they put out a bunch of different Plutarch books, and this is one of them. I already talked about a volume of Roman lives. This one is pretty interesting. The rise and fall of Athens, told through these 9 Greek lives. Because this actually does work as a book. Plutarch's lives are really readable. All his short little biographies are really readable now. He's one of the ancient authors who really translates well into English, and just really entertaining, interesting biographies. He had access to sources, of course, which we do not, although a big chunk of this book is taken from Thucydides. He was using Thucydides, I think, as his main source for a lot of this, but not all of it. He had other sources, which makes this pretty valuable. Basically, this tells mostly the story of how Athens grew in power, fought in the Persian Wars and then the Peloponnesian Wars, and how they lost their power at the end because they lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. what Athens did is, at the end of the Persian Wars, when they joined up with Sparta and some other Greek cities and fought off the Persians, which is told in Herodotus, they formed during that war something called the Delian League, which was because they called it that because they all met on Delos, an island. And the Delian League was run by Athens, and it was a league of different Greek cities throughout Greece, and they were a league that was meant to continue the war against Persia and keep Persia out of Greece. But what Athens did is, once they had control of this league, they used the Delian League to create their own empire. So after kicking out the Persians, because the Persians were going to take over Greece and create an empire in Greece, or extend their empire into Greece, Athens became an empire within Greece. They basically did what they were afraid the Persians would do, but they did it to themselves. They did it throughout Greece, and Athens became the head of an empire. A little one within Greece, but still, that's pretty much what it was. And eventually, this brought them in conflict with the Spartans and some other Greek cities, in which created the Peloponnesian War, a huge conflict within Greece, which was kind of like their World War II, and it was chronicled by Thucydides. It was a devastating war. Thucydides writes a very detailed account about that war and the devastation of it. It reads much more realistically and seriously than Herodotus does. Well worth reading. And it talks about a lot of the historical characters you see in this book. This book has lives of some pretty important Greeks. It starts with Theseus, which is a mythical one. It's kind of odd that it starts there, but Plutarch did write about a couple mythical characters, and Theseus is one of them. So he takes everything that was known about Theseus and put together a life of Theseus, even though it was all mythical. And he knows that as he's writing it, but Theseus might have existed. A lot of people in Greece just accepted that Theseus did exist, even though he's a mythical character. Greeks were like that with their myths. They just, yeah, that happened. But then he moves on to Solon, the lawgiver, who we hear a little bit about in Herodotus. But he was a real person, and we still have some poetry that was written by Solon. Don't know much about him, though, but he was a lawgiver. He changed a lot in Greece. So his life is in here, and that's pretty interesting. And then he moves on to some historical personages that we know a little bit more about. One of the most interesting ones is Themistocles. Themistocles was a politician who basically, there are weird points in history where the entire course of history can change from the actions of one person. This does happen occasionally. It happened with Themistocles, because if Themistocles had not done some of the things that he had done, the entire world might be different. Because he basically talked the Greeks into, he knew that the Persians were going to come back after the Battle of Marathon. And so he talked them into building a fleet of warships, which proved essential when the Persians did come to invade Greece. And he also came up with the strategy of fighting them. If they had not done these things, it's very likely Persia would have conquered Greece, and then the world would be very different. How different, we don't know. There are some historians that have gone so far as to say that the actions that happened during the Persian War saved Western civilization. And there's some truth to that. Because things like philosophy and politics, everything would be very different. We don't know how different, but they would be different. That's without question. So whether he actually saved Western civilization or not, he did change history. And so his life is a very interesting one. And it kind of demonstrates some of the strengths and weaknesses of Greek politics, Greek democracy, which was basically all the male Greek citizens had a say in everything. Slaves, of course, didn't. Women didn't. So most of the population didn't. But in Athens, all the male citizens had a say in everything. This had its good points, but it also had its bad points. And you see a lot of the bad points in this book with some of the terrible decisions that were made. You get a little of that in the life of Themistocles, but you get a lot of that later on when you get into past the life of Pericles. Pericles, famous Greek statesman who is a big part of the Delian League taking over, a big part of creating the Athenian Empire. Pericles pretty much steered the way of the way they fought the Peloponnesian War, at least in the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Very important historical character, Pericles. You learn a lot about him in Thucydides. If you read Thucydides, Thucydides knew Pericles, and so that's interesting. But this is an interesting take on him. And then you get into the life of Alcibiades, which I read a little bit about earlier, the little excerpt I read. He was an interesting character because he started off on the Athenian side, became very unpopular, and switched over to the Peloponnesian side. So he was a very famous turncoat, Alcibiades. His life is super dramatic. Yeah. Well worth your time, just his life alone. Very interesting character. And it's in those parts of the book, and you get to the life of the general Nisus, where you get to read about the worst disaster in ancient Athenian history, where they decide to invade Sicily, which was a terrible, terrible, terrible idea, and it went horribly wrong. Some of their bad decisions really led to their defeat, but it was a long, drawn-out, awful war, the Peloponnesian War. And you get some pretty good insights to that war in this book. It's really fascinating, this book. It's an interesting look into Athenian history. Very important part of world history. Great stuff. I, of course, find it fascinating because I'm really fascinated by ancient history. This particular part of history, it led me to journey to Athens and look at all these places that are talked about in this book and in Herodotus and Thucydides. So, of course, I find it fascinating, but I think it'll be an interesting read for anybody who's interested in history. It's easy. It's an easy read. It's not one of those, like, historical texts written by ancient authors that you have to, like, ponder and decipher, even though it's in English. This is a pretty easy read, and it's really interesting, and I highly recommend it. I'm going to finish droning on about it now. Plutarch, The Rise and Fall of Athens, 9 Greek Lives. It's really interesting. You should read it. Okay, guys. Thank you for joining me once again here at the Rustic Fun Lodge. I'm going to be here for a couple days, so I will catch you here next time.